That is, as Mei Yaochen says, is it possible to make the front and rear of an army each swiftly responsive to attack on the other, just as though they were part of a single living body? I should answer, yes. For the men of Wu and the men of Yu are enemies. Cf. 6. Section 21. Yet if they are crossing a river in the same boat and are caught by a storm, they will come to each other's assistance, just as the left hand helps the right. The meaning is, if two enemies will help each other in a time of common peril, how much more should two parts of the same army, bound together as they are by every tie of interest and fellow feeling? Yet it is notorious that many a campaign has been ruined through lack of cooperation, especially in the case of allied armies. 31. Hence it is not enough to put one's trust in the tethering of horses and the burying of chariot wheels in the ground. These quaint devices to prevent one's army from running away recall the Athenian hero Saupanes, who carried the anchor with him at the Battle of Plataea, by means of which he fastened himself firmly to one spot. See Herodotus, 9:74. It is not enough, says Sun Tzŭ, to render flight impossible by such mechanical means. You will not succeed unless your men have tenacity and unity of purpose, and, above all, a spirit of sympathetic cooperation. This is the lesson which can be learned from the Shuijin. 32. The principle on which to manage an army is to set up one standard of courage which all must reach. Literally, level the courage of all as though it were that of one. If the ideal army is to form a single organic whole, then it follows that the resolution and spirit of its component parts must be of the same quality, or at any rate must not fall below a certain standard. Wellington's seemingly ungrateful description of his army at Waterloo as the worst he had ever commanded meant no more than that it was deficient in this important particular, unity of spirit and courage. Had he not foreseen the Belgian defections and carefully kept those troops in the background, he would almost certainly have lost the day. 33. How to make the best of both strong and weak. That is a question involving the proper use of ground. Mei Yaochen's paraphrase is, the way to eliminate the differences of strong and weak and to make both serviceable is to utilize accidental features of the ground. Less reliable troops, if posted in strong positions, will hold out as long as better troops on more exposed terrain. The advantage of position neutralizes the inferiority in stamina and courage. Colonel Henderson says, with all respect to the textbooks and to the ordinary tactical teaching, I am inclined to think that the study of ground is often overlooked, and that by no means sufficient importance is attached to the selection of positions, and to the immense advantages that are to be derived, whether you are defending or attacking, from the proper utilization of natural features. 2. 34. Thus the skillful general conducts his army just as though he were leading a single man, willy-nilly, by the hand. Tu Mu says, the simile has reference to the ease with which he does it. 35. It is the business of a general to be quiet and thus ensure secrecy, upright and just, and thus maintain order. 36. He must be able to mystify his officers and men by false reports and appearances. Literally, to deceive their eyes and ears, and thus keep them in total ignorance. Tsao Kung gives us one of his excellent apothegms. The troops must not be allowed to share your schemes in the beginning. They may only rejoice with you over their happy outcome. To mystify, mislead, and surprise the enemy is one of the first principles in war, as had been frequently pointed out. But how about the other process? The mystification of one's own men. Those who may think that Sun Tzŭ is overemphatic on this point would do well to read Colonel Henderson's remarks on Stonewall Jackson's Valley campaign. The infinite pains, he says, with which Jackson sought to conceal, even from his most trusted staff officers, his movements, his intentions, and his thoughts, a commander less thorough would have pronounced useless, etc., etc. 3. in the year 8880. As we read in ch. 47 of the Ho Han Shu, Pan Tzŭ took the field with 25,000 men from Khotan and other Central Asian states with the object of crushing Yarkand. The king of Kutcha replied by dispatching his chief commander to succor the place with an army drawn from the kingdoms of Wensu, Kyumo, and Waitoyu, totaling 50,000 men. Pan Tzŭ summoned his officers and also the king of Khotan to a council of war and said, "Our forces are now outnumbered and unable to make head against the enemy. The best plan, then, is for us to separate and disperse, each in a different direction. The king of Khotan will march away by the easterly route, and I will then return myself towards the west. Let us wait until the evening drum has sounded, and then start." Pan Tzŭ now secretly released the prisoners whom he had taken alive, and the king of Kutcha was thus informed of his plans. Much elated by the news, the latter set off at once at the head of 10,000 horsemen to bar Pan Tzŭ's retreat in the west, while the king of Wensu rode eastward with 8,000 horse in order to intercept the king of Khotan. As soon as Pan Tzŭ knew that the two chieftains had gone, he called his divisions together, got them well in hand, and at cockcrow hurled them against the army of Yarkand, as it lay encamped. The barbarians, panic-stricken, fled in confusion, and were closely pursued by Pan Tzŭ. Over 5,000 heads were brought back as trophies, besides immense spoils in the shape of horses and cattle and valuables of every description. Yarkand then capitulating, Kutcha and the other kingdoms drew off their respective forces. From that time forward, Pan Tzŭ's prestige completely overawed the countries of the West. In this case, we see that the Chinese general not only kept his own officers in ignorance of his real plans, but actually took the bold step of dividing his army in order to deceive the enemy. 37. By altering his arrangements and changing his plans. Wang Shi thinks that this means not using the same stratagem twice. He keeps the enemy without definite knowledge. Chang Yu, in a quotation from another work, says, "The axiom that war is based on deception does not apply only to deception of the enemy. You must deceive even your own soldiers. Make them follow you, but without letting them know why. By shifting his camp and taking circuitous routes, he prevents the enemy from anticipating his purpose." 38. At the critical moment, the leader of an army acts like one who has climbed up a height and then kicks away the ladder behind him. He carries his men deep into hostile territory before he shows his hand. Literally, releases the spring, CV, section 15, that is, takes some decisive step which makes it impossible for the army to return, like Xiang Yu, who sunk his ships after crossing a river. Chen Hao, followed by Chia Lin, understands the words less well as puts forth every artifice at his command. 39. He burns his boats and breaks his cooking pots, like a shepherd driving a flock of sheep. He drives his men this way and that, and none knows whither he is going. Tumu says, "The army is only cognizant of orders to advance or retreat. It is ignorant of the ulterior ends of attacking and conquering." 40. To muster his host and bring it into danger. This may be termed the business of the general. Sun Tzŭ means that after mobilization there should be no delay in aiming a blow at the enemy's heart. Note how he returns again and again to this point. Among the warring states of ancient China, desertion was no doubt a much more present fear and serious evil than it is in the armies of today. 41. The different measures suited to the 9 varieties of ground. Chang Yu says, "One must not be hidebound in interpreting the rules for the 9 varieties of ground. The expediency of aggressive or defensive tactics, and the fundamental laws of human nature, these are things that must most certainly be studied." 42. When invading hostile territory, the general principle is that penetrating deeply brings cohesion. Penetrating but a short way means dispersion. Cf. Supra, Section 20. 43. When you leave your own country behind and take your army across neighborhood territory, you find yourself on critical ground. This ground is curiously mentioned in 8. Section 2, but it does not figure among the 9 situations or the 6 calamities in Chapter 10. One's first impulse would be to translate a distant ground, but this, if we can trust the commentators, is precisely what is not meant here. Mei Yaochen says it is a position not far enough advanced to be called facile, and not near enough to home to be dispersive, but something between the two. Wang Shi says, it is ground separated from home by an interjacent state, whose territory we have had to cross in order to reach it. Hence, it is incumbent on us to settle our business there quickly. He adds that this position is of rare occurrence, which is the reason why it is not included among the 9 situations. When there are means of communication on all 4 sides, the ground is one of intersecting highways. 44. When you penetrate deeply into a country, it is serious ground. When you penetrate but a little way, it is facile ground. 45. When you have the enemy's strongholds on your rear and narrow passes in front, it is Hamadan ground. When there is no place of refuge at all, it is desperate ground. 46. Therefore, on dispersive ground, I would inspire my men with unity of purpose. This end, according to Tzŭ, is best attained by remaining on the defensive and avoiding battle. Cf. Supra, Section 11. On facile ground, I would see that there is close connection between all parts of my army. As Tzŭ says, the object is to guard against 2 possible contingencies. 1. The desertion of our own troops. 2. A sudden attack on the part of the enemy. Cf. 7. Section 17. Mei Yaochen says, on the march, the regiments should be in close touch. In an encampment, there should be continuity between the fortifications. 47. On contentious ground, I would hurry up my rear. This is Tsio Kung's interpretation. Changyu adopts it, saying, we must quickly bring up our rear, so that head and tail may both reach the goal. That is, they must not be allowed to straggle up a long way apart. Mei Yaochen offers another equally plausible explanation. Supposing the enemy has not yet reached the coveted position, and we are behind him, we should advance with all speed in order to dispute its possession. Chen Hao, on the other hand, assuming that the enemy has had time to select his own ground, quotes 6. Section 1, where Sun Tzŭ warns us against coming exhausted to the attack. His own idea of the situation is rather vaguely expressed. If there is a favorable position lying in front of you, detach a picked body of troops to occupy it. Then if the enemy, relying on their numbers, come up to make a fight for it, you may fall quickly on their rear with your main body, and victory will be assured. It was thus, he adds, that Chaoshi beat the army of Qin. See page 57. 48. On open ground, I would keep a vigilant eye on my defenses. On ground of intersecting highways, I would consolidate my alliances. 49. On serious ground, I would try to ensure a continuous stream of supplies. The commentators take this as referring to forage and plunder, not, as one might expect, to an unbroken communication with a home base. On difficult ground, I would keep pushing on along the road. 50. On Hamadan ground, I would block any way of retreat. Meng Shi says, to make it seem that I meant to defend the position, whereas my real intention is to burst suddenly through the enemy's lines. Mei Yaochen says, in order to make my soldiers fight with desperation. Wang Shi says, fearing lest my men be tempted to run away. Tzŭ points out that this is the converse of 7. Section 36, where it is the enemy who is surrounded. In 532 AD, Cao Huan, afterwards emperor and canonized as Shunwu, was surrounded by a great army under Chu Chao and others. His own force was comparatively small, consisting only of 2,000 horse and something under 30,000 foot. The lines of investment had not been drawn very closely together, gaps being left at certain points. But Cao Huan, instead of trying to escape, actually made a shift to block all the remaining outlets himself by driving into them a number of oxen and donkeys roped together. As soon as his officers and men saw that there was nothing for it but to conquer or die, their spirits rose to an extraordinary pitch of exultation, and they charged with such desperate ferocity that the opposing ranks broke and crumbled under their onslaught. On desperate ground, I would proclaim to my soldiers the hopelessness of saving their lives. Tzŭ says, "Burn your baggage and impedimenta, throw away your stores and provisions, choke up the wells, destroy your cooking stoves, and make it plain to your men that they cannot survive, but must fight to the death." Mei Yaochen says, "The only chance of life lies in giving up all hope of it." This concludes what Sun Tzŭ has to say about grounds and the variations corresponding to them. Reviewing the passages which bear on this important subject, we cannot fail to be struck by the desultory and unmethodical fashion in which it is treated. Sun Tzŭ begins abruptly in 8. Section 2 to enumerate variations before touching on grounds at all, but only mentions 5, namely numbers 7, 5, 8, and 9 of the subsequent list, and 1 that is not included in it. A few varieties of ground are dealt with in the earlier portion of Chapter 9, and then Chapter 10 sets forth 6 new grounds, with 6 variations of plan to match. None of these is mentioned again, though the first is hardly to be distinguished from ground number 4 in the next chapter. At last, in Chapter 11, we come to the 9 grounds par excellence, immediately followed by the variations. This takes us down to section 14. In sections 4345, fresh definitions are provided for numbers 5, 6, 2, 8, and 9 in the order given, as well as for the 10th ground noticed in Chapter 8, and finally, the 9 variations are enumerated once more from beginning to end, all, with the exception of 5, 6, and 7, being different from those previously given. Though it is impossible to account for the present state of Sun Tzŭ's text, a few suggestive facts may be brought into prominence. 1. Chapter 8, according to the title, should deal with 9 variations, whereas only 5 appear. 2. It is an abnormally short chapter. 3. Chapter 11 is entitled The 9 Grounds. Several of these are defined twice over, besides which there are 2 distinct lists of the corresponding variations. 4. The length of the chapter is disproportionate, being double that of any other except 9. I do not propose to draw any inferences from these facts, beyond the general conclusion that Sun Tzŭ's work cannot have come down to us in the shape in which it left his hands. Chapter 8 is obviously defective and probably out of place, while 11 seems to contain matter that has either been added by a later hand or ought to appear elsewhere. 51. For it is the soldier's disposition to offer an obstinate resistance when surrounded, to fight hard when he cannot help himself, and to obey promptly when he has fallen into danger. Changyu alludes to the conduct of Pan Xiao's devoted followers in 73 AD. The story runs thus in the Ho Han Shu, ch. 47, when Pan Xiao arrived at Shanshan, Kuang, the king of the country, received him at first with great politeness and respect, but shortly afterwards his behavior underwent a sudden change, and he became remiss and negligent. Pan Xiao spoke about this to the officers of his suite. "Have you noticed," he said, "that Kuang's polite intentions are on the wane? This must signify that envoys have come from the northern barbarians, and that consequently he is in a state of indecision, not knowing with which side to throw in his lot. That surely is the reason. The truly wise man, we are told, can perceive things before they have come to pass. How much more, then, those that are already manifest?" Thereupon he called one of the natives who had been assigned to his service, and set a trap for him, saying, "Where are those envoys from the Tzŭ who arrived some day ago?" The man was so taken aback that between surprise and fear, he presently blurted out the whole truth. Pan Tzŭ, keeping his informant carefully under lock and key, then summoned a general gathering of his officers, 36 in all, and began drinking with them. When the wine had mounted into their heads a little, he tried to rouse their spirit still further by addressing them thus: "Gentlemen, here we are in the heart of an isolated region, anxious to achieve riches and honor by some great exploit. Now it happens that an ambassador from the Tzŭ arrived in this kingdom only a few days ago, and the result is that the respectful courtesy extended towards us by our royal host has disappeared. Should this envoy prevail upon him to seize our party and hand us over to the Tzŭ, our bones will become food for the wolves of the desert. What are we to do?" With one accord, the officers replied, "Standing as we do in peril of our lives, we will follow our commander through life and death." For the sequel of this adventure, see Chapter 12. Section 1 Note 52. We cannot enter into alliance with neighboring princes until we are acquainted with their designs. We are not fit to lead an army on the march unless we are familiar with the face of the country, its mountains and forests, its pitfalls and precipices, its marshes and swamps. We shall be unable to turn natural advantages to account unless we make use of local guides. These 3 sentences are repeated from 7. Sections 12-14. In order to emphasize their importance, the commentators seem to think, I prefer to regard them as interpolated here in order to form an antecedent to the following words. With regard to local guides, Sun Tzŭ might have added that there is always the risk of going wrong, either through their treachery or some misunderstanding such as Livy records, XXI. 13. Hannibal, we are told, ordered a guide to lead him into the neighborhood of Casinum, where there was an important pass to be occupied, but his Carthaginian accent, unsuited to the pronunciation of Latin names, caused the guide to understand Casilinum instead of Casinum, and turning from his proper route, he took the army in that direction, the mistake not being discovered until they had almost arrived. 53. To be ignorant of any one of the following 4 or 5 principles does not befit a warlike prince. 54. When a warlike prince attacks a powerful state, his generalship shows itself in preventing the concentration of the enemy's forces. He overawes his opponents, and their allies are prevented from joining against him. Meitaken constructs one of the chains of reasoning that are so much affected by the Chinese. In attacking a powerful state, if you can divide her forces, you will have a superiority in strength. If you have a superiority in strength, you will overawe the enemy. If you overawe the enemy, the neighboring states will be frightened, and if the neighboring states are frightened, the enemy's allies will be prevented from joining her. The following gives a stronger meaning. If the great state has once been defeated before she has had time to summon her allies, then the lesser states will hold aloof and refrain from massing their forces. Chen Hao and Chang Yu take the sentence in quite another way. The former says, powerful though a prince may be, if he attacks a large state, he will be unable to raise enough troops and must rely to some extent on external aid. If he dispenses with this, and with overweening confidence in his own strength, simply tries to intimidate the enemy, he will surely be defeated. Chang Yu puts his view thus: if we recklessly attack a large state, our own people will be discontented and hang back. But if, as will then be the case, our display of military force is inferior by half to that of the enemy, the other chieftains will take fright and refuse to join us. 55. Hence he does not strive to ally himself with all and sundry, nor does he foster the power of other states. He carries out his own secret designs, keeping his antagonists in awe. The train of thought, as said by Li Xiaochuan, appears to be this: Secure against a combination of his enemies, he can afford to reject entangling alliances and simply pursue his own secret designs. His prestige enables him to dispense with external friendships. Thus he is able to capture their cities and overthrow their kingdoms. This paragraph, though written many years before the Qin state became a serious menace, is not a bad summary of the policy by which the famous six chancellors gradually paved the way for her final triumph under Shi Huangdi. Chang Yu, following up his previous note, thinks that Sun Tzŭ is condemning this attitude of cold-blooded selfishness and haughty isolation. 56. Bestow rewards without regard to rule. Wu Tzu, ch. 3, less wisely says, let advance be richly rewarded and retreat be heavily punished. Issue orders. Literally, hang or post up. Without regard to previous arrangements. In order to prevent treachery, says Wang Shi. The general meaning is made clear by Tzŭ Kung's quotation from the Sima Fa. Give instructions only on sighting the enemy. Give rewards when you see deserving deeds. Tzŭ Kung's paraphrase. The final instructions you give to your army should not correspond with those that have been previously posted up. Chang Yu simplifies this into your arrangements should not be divulged beforehand. And Qialin says, there should be no fixity in your rules and arrangements. Not only is there danger in letting your plans be known, but war often necessitates the entire reversal of them at the last moment. And you will be able to handle a whole army as though you had to do with but a single man. Cf. Supra, Section 34. 57. Confront your soldiers with the deed itself. Never let them know your design. Literally, do not tell them words, i.e., do not give your reasons for any order. Lord Mansfield once told a junior colleague to give no reasons for his decisions, and the maxim is even more applicable to a general than to a judge. When the outlook is bright, bring it before their eyes, but tell them nothing when the situation is gloomy. 58. Place your army in deadly peril, and it will survive. Plunge it into desperate straits, and it will come off in safety. These words of Sun Tzŭ were once quoted by Han Hsin in explanation of the tactics he employed in one of his most brilliant battles, already alluded to on page 28. In 204 BC, he was sent against the army of Zhao and halted 10 miles from the mouth of the Qingxing Pass, where the enemy had mustered in full force. Here, at midnight, he detached a body of 2,000 light cavalry, every man of which was furnished with a red flag. Their instructions were to make their way through narrow defile and keep a secret watch on the enemy. When the men of Zhao see me in full flight, Han Hsin said, they will abandon their fortifications and give chase. This must be the sign for you to rush in, pluck down the Zhao standards, and set up the red banners of Han in their stead. Turning then to his other officers, he remarked, our adversary holds a strong position and is not likely to come out and attack us until he sees the standard and drums of the commander-in-chief, for fear I should turn back and escape through the mountains. So saying, he first of all sent out a division consisting of 10,000 men and ordered them to form in line of battle with their backs to the river Ti. Seeing this maneuver, the whole army of Zhao broke into loud laughter. By this time it was broad daylight, and Han Hsin, displaying the generalissimo's flag, marched out of the pass with drums beating, and was immediately engaged by the enemy. A great battle followed, lasting for some time, until at length Han Hsin and his colleague Chang and I, leaving drums and banner on the field, fled to the division on the river bank, where another fierce battle was raging. The enemy rushed out to pursue them and to secure the trophies, thus denuding their ramparts of men, but the two generals succeeded in joining the other army, which was fighting with the utmost desperation. The time had now come for the 2,000 horsemen to play their part. As soon as they saw the men of Zhao following up their advantage, they galloped behind the deserted walls, tore up the enemy's flags and replaced them by those of Han. When the Tzŭ army looked back from the pursuit, the sight of these red flags struck them with terror. Convinced that the Hans had got in and overpowered their king, they broke up in wild disorder, every effort of their leader to stay the panic being in vain. Then the Han army fell on them from both sides and completed the rout, killing a number and capturing the rest, amongst whom was King Ye himself. After the battle, some of Han Hsin's officers came to him and said, "In the art of war we are told to have a hill or tumulus on the right rear, and a river or marsh on the left front." This appears to be a blend of Sun Tzŭ and Taikung. C9 Section 9 and note. You, on the contrary, ordered us to draw up our troops with the river at our back. Under these conditions, how did you manage to gain the victory? The general replied, "I fear you gentlemen have not studied the art of war with sufficient care. Is it not written there, 'Plunge your army into desperate straits and it will come off in safety. Place it in deadly peril and it will survive.' Had I taken the usual course, I should never have been able to bring my colleague round. What says the military classic? Swoop down on the marketplace and drive the men off to fight. This passage does not occur in the present text of Sun Tzŭ. If I had not placed my troops in a position where they were obliged to fight for their lives, but had allowed each man to follow his own discretion, there would have been a general debandade, and it would have been impossible to do anything with them." The officers admitted the force of his argument and said, "These are higher tactics than we should have been capable of." See Chien Han Shu, ch 34, ff 4, 5. 59. For it is precisely when a force has fallen into harm's way that is capable of striking a blow for victory. Danger has a bracing effect. 60. Success in warfare is gained by carefully accommodating ourselves to the enemy's purpose. Tzŭ Kung says, "Feign stupidity, by an appearance of yielding and falling in with the enemy's wishes." Chong Yu's note makes the meaning clear. If the enemy shows an inclination to advance, lure him on to do so. If he is anxious to retreat, delay on purpose that he may carry out his intention. The object is to make him remiss and contemptuous before we deliver our attack. 61. By persistently hanging on the enemy's flank. I understand the first 4 words to mean accompanying the enemy in one direction. Tzŭ Kung says, "Unite the soldiers and make for the enemy." But such a violent displacement of characters is quite indefensible. We shall succeed in the long run. Literally, after 1,000 li. In killing the commander-in-chief. Always a great point with the Chinese. 62. This is called ability to accomplish a thing by sheer cunning. 63. On the day that you take up your command, block the frontier passes, destroy the official tallies. These were tablets of bamboo or wood, one half of which was issued as a permit or passport by the official in charge of a gate. Cf. the border warden of Luan U3. 24, who may have had similar duties. When this half was returned to him, within a fixed period, he was authorized to open the gate and let the traveler through, and stop the passage of all emissaries, either to or from the enemy's country. 64. Be stern in the council chamber. Show no weakness, and insist on your plans being ratified by the sovereign, so that you may control the situation. Mei Yaochen understands the whole sentence to mean, take the strictest precautions to ensure secrecy in your deliberations. 65. If the enemy leaves a door open, you must rush in. 66. Forestall your opponent by seizing what he holds dear. Cf. Supra, Section 18. And subtly contrive to time his arrival on the ground. Chn Hao's explanation. If I manage to seize a favorable position, but the enemy does not appear on the scene, the advantage thus obtained cannot be turned to any practical account. He who intends, therefore, to occupy a position of importance to the enemy must begin by making an artful appointment, so to speak, with his antagonist and cajole him into going there as well. Mei Yaochen explains that this artful appointment is to be made through the medium of the enemy's own spies, who will carry back just the amount of information that we choose to give them. Then, having cunningly disclosed our intentions, we must manage, though starting after the enemy, to arrive before him. 7. 4. We must start after him in order to ensure his marching thither. We must arrive before him in order to capture the place without trouble. Taken thus, the present passage lends some support to Mei Yaochen's interpretation of section 47. 67. Walk in the path defined by rule. Xia Lin says, victory is the only thing that matters, and this cannot be achieved by adhering to conventional canons. It is unfortunate that this variant rests on very slight authority, for the sense yielded is certainly much more satisfactory. Napoleon, as we know, according to the veterans of the old school whom he defeated, won his battles by violating every accepted canon of warfare. And accommodate yourself to the enemy until you can fight a decisive battle. Tzŭ says, conform to the enemy's tactics until a favorable opportunity offers, then come forth and engage in a battle that shall prove decisive. 68. At first, then, exhibit the coyness of a maiden until the enemy gives you an opening. Afterwards, emulate the rapidity of a running hare, and it will be too late for the enemy to oppose you. As the hare is noted for its extreme timidity, the comparison hardly appears felicitous. But of course Sun Tzŭ was thinking only of its speed. The words have been taken to mean, you must flee from the enemy as quickly as an escaping hare, but this is rightly rejected by Tzŭ. 1 Giles Biographical Dictionary, number 399. 2. The Science of War, page 333. 3. Stonewall Jackson, volume 1, page 421. Chapter 12. The Attack by Fire. Rather more than half the chapter, sections 113, is devoted to the subject of fire, after which the author branches off into other topics. 1. Sun Tzŭ said, there are 5 ways of attacking with fire. The first is to burn soldiers in their camp. So Tzŭ. Li Chuan says, set fire to the camp and kill the soldiers when they try to escape from the flames. Pan Chao, sent on a diplomatic mission to the king of Shanshan, c11. Section 51 note, found himself placed in extreme peril by the unexpected arrival of an envoy from the Xiongnu, the mortal enemies of the Chinese. In consultation with his officers, he exclaimed, never venture, never win. 1. The only course open to us now is to make an assault by fire on the barbarians under cover of night, when they will not be able to discern our numbers. Profiting by their panic, we shall exterminate them completely. This will cool the king's courage and cover us with glory, besides ensuring the success of our mission. The officers all replied that it would be necessary to discuss the matter first with the intendant. Pan Chao then fell into a passion. It is today, he cried, that our fortunes must be decided. The intendant is only a humdrum civilian, who on hearing of our project will certainly be afraid, and everything will be brought to light. An inglorious death is no worthy fate for valiant warriors. All then agreed to do as he wished. Accordingly, as soon as night came on, he and his little band quickly made their way to the barbarian camp. A strong gale was blowing at the time. Pan Chao ordered 10 of the party to take drums and hide behind the enemy's barracks, it being arranged that when they saw flames shoot up, they should begin drumming and yelling with all their might. The rest of his men, armed with bows and crossbows, he posted in ambuscade at the gate of the camp. He then set fire to the place from the windward side, whereupon a deafening noise of drums and shouting arose on the front and rear of the Xiongnu, who rushed out pell-mell in frantic disorder. Pan Chao slew 3 of them with his own hand, while his companions cut off the heads of the envoy and 30 of his suite. The remainder, more than 100 in all, perished in the flames. On the following day, Sun Tzŭ, divining his thoughts, said with uplifted hand, "Although you did not go with us last night, I should not think, sir, of taking sole credit for our exploit." This satisfied Sun, and Sun Tzŭ, having sent for Kuang, king of Shanshan, showed him the head of the barbarian envoy. The whole kingdom was seized with fear and trembling, which Sun Tzŭ took steps to allay by issuing a public proclamation. Then, taking the king's sons as hostage, he returned to make his report to Tzŭ. Ho Han Shu, ch. 47, ff. 2. The second is to burn stores. Tzŭ says, provisions, fuel and fodder. In order to subdue the rebellious population of Qiangnan, Cao Kung recommended Wen Ti of the Sui dynasty to make periodical raids and burn their stores of grain, a policy which in the long run proved entirely successful. The third is to burn baggage trains. An example given is the destruction of Yuan Shao's wagons and impedimenta by Tzŭ in 200 AD. The fourth is to burn arsenals and magazines. Tzŭ says that the things contained in arsenals and magazines are the same. He specifies weapons and other implements, bullion and clothing. Cf. 7. Section 11. The fifth is to hurl dropping fire amongst the enemy. Tzŭ says in the Tung Tien, to drop fire into the enemy's camp. The method by which this may be done is to set the tips of arrows alight by dipping them into a brazier, and then shoot them from powerful crossbows into the enemy's lines. 2. In order to carry out an attack, we must have means available. Cao Kung thinks that traitors in the enemy's camp are referred to, but Chen Hao is more likely to be right in saying, we must have favorable circumstances in general, not merely traitors to help us. Xia Lin says, we must avail ourselves of wind and dry weather. The material for raising fire should always be kept in readiness. Tzŭ suggests as material for making fire, dry vegetable matter, reeds, brushwood, straw, grease, oil, etc. Here we have the material cause. Changyu says, vessels for hoarding fire, stuff for lighting fires. 3. There is a proper season for making attacks with fire and special days for starting a conflagration. 4. The proper season is when the weather is very dry. The special days are those when the moon is in the constellations of the sieve, the wall, the wing, or the crossbar. These are, respectively, the 7th, 14th, 27th, and 28th of the 28 stellar mansions, corresponding roughly to Sagittarius, Pegasus, Crater, and Corvus. For these 4 are all days of rising wind. 5. In attacking with fire, one should be prepared to meet 5 possible developments. 6. 1. When fire breaks out inside the enemy's camp, respond at once with an attack from without. 7. 2. If there is an outbreak of fire, but the enemy soldiers remain quiet, bide your time and do not attack. The prime object of attacking with fire is to throw the enemy into confusion. If this effect is not produced, it means that the enemy is ready to receive us. Hence the necessity for caution. 8. 3. When the force of the flames has reached its height, follow it up with an attack, if that is practicable. If not, stay where you are. Tzŭ Kung says, if you see a possible way, advance, but if you find the difficulties too great, retire. 9. 4. If it is possible to make an assault with fire from without, do not wait for it to break out within, but deliver your attack at a favorable moment. Tzŭ says that the previous paragraphs had reference to the fire breaking out, either accidentally, we may suppose, or by the agency of incendiaries, inside the enemy's camp. But, he continues, if the enemy is settled in a waste place littered with quantities of grass, or if he has pitched his camp in a position which can be burnt out, we must carry our fire against him at any seasonable opportunity and not await on in hopes of an outbreak occurring within, for fear our opponents should themselves burn up the surrounding vegetation and thus render our own attempts fruitless. The famous Li Ling once baffled the leader of the Xiongnu in this way. The latter, taking advantage of a favorable wind, tried to set fire to the Chinese general's camp, but found that every scrap of combustible vegetation in the neighborhood had already been burnt down. On the other hand, Patsai, a general of the Yellow Turban rebels, was badly defeated in 184 AD through his neglect of this simple precaution. At the head of a large army, he was besieging Xiachangsha, which was held by Huang Fusung. The garrison was very small, and a general feeling of nervousness pervaded the ranks. So Huang Fusung called his officers together and said, "In war, there are various indirect methods of attack, and numbers do not count for everything." The commentator here quotes Sun Tzŭ, v. sections 5, 6, and 10. Now the rebels have pitched their camp in the midst of thick grass which will easily burn when the wind blows. If we set fire to it at night, they will be thrown into a panic, and we can make a sortie and attack them on all sides at once, thus emulating the achievement of Tian Tan. See page 90. That same evening, a strong breeze sprang up, so Huang Fusung instructed his soldiers to bind reeds together into torches and mount guard on the city walls, after which he sent out a band of daring men who stealthily made their way through the lines and started the fire with loud shouts and yells. Simultaneously, a glare of light shot up from the city walls, and Huang Fusung, sounding his drums, led a rapid charge, which threw the rebels into confusion and put them to headlong flight. Ho Han Shu, ch. 71. 10. 5. When you start a fire, be to windward of it. Do not attack from the leeward. Chong Yu, following Tu Yu, says, "When you make a fire, the enemy will retreat away from it. If you oppose his retreat and attack him then, he will fight desperately, which will not conduce to your success." A rather more obvious explanation is given by Tu Mu. If the wind is in the east, begin burning to the east of the enemy and follow up the attack yourself from that side. If you start the fire on the east side and then attack from the west, you will suffer in the same way as your enemy. 11. A wind that rises in the daytime lasts long, but a night breeze soon falls. Cf. Lao Tzu's saying, "A violent wind does not last the space of a morning." Tao Te Ching, Chapter 23. Mei Yaochen and Wang Shi say, "A day breeze dies down at nightfall, and a night breeze at daybreak." This is what happens as a general rule. The phenomenon observed may be correct enough, but how this sense is to be obtained is not apparent. 12. In every army, the 5 developments connected with fire must be known, the movements of the stars calculated, and a watch kept for the proper days. Tu Mu says, "We must make calculations as to the paths of the stars and watch for the days on which wind will rise, before making our attack with fire." Chong Yu seems to interpret the text differently. We must not only know how to assail our opponents with fire, but also be on our guard against similar attacks from them. 13. Hence those who use fire as an aid to the attack show intelligence. Those who use water as an aid to the attack gain an accession of strength. 14. By means of water, an enemy may be intercepted, but not robbed of all his belongings. Tsio Kung's note is, "We can merely obstruct the enemy's road or divide his army, but not sweep away all his accumulated stores." Water can do useful service, but it lacks the terrible destructive power of fire. This is the reason, Chong Yu concludes, why the former is dismissed in a couple of sentences, whereas the attack by fire is discussed in detail. Wu Tzu, ch. 4, speaks thus of the 2 elements. If an army is encamped on low-lying marshy ground, from which the water cannot run off, and where the rainfall is heavy, it may be submerged by a flood. If an army is encamped in wild marshlands thickly overgrown with weeds and brambles, and visited by frequent gales, it may be exterminated by fire. 15. Unhappy is the fate of one who tries to win his battles and succeed in his attacks without cultivating the spirit of enterprise, for the result is waste of time and general stagnation. This is one of the most perplexing passages in Sun Tzŭ. Tzŭ Kung says, rewards for good service should not be deferred a single day. And Tumu, if you do not take opportunity to advance and reward the deserving, your subordinates will not carry out your commands, and disaster will ensue. For several reasons, however, and in spite of the formidable array of scholars on the other side, I prefer the interpretation suggested by Mei Yaochen alone, whose words I will quote. Those who want to make sure of succeeding in their battles and assaults must seize the favorable moments when they come and not shrink on occasion from heroic measures. That is to say, they must resort to such means of attack of fire, water, and the like. What they must not do, and what will prove fatal, is to sit still and simply hold to the advantages they have got. 16. Hence the saying, the enlightened ruler lays his plans well ahead. The good general cultivates his resources. Tumu quotes the following from the Sanlu, ch. The warlike prince controls his soldiers by his authority, kits them together by good faith, and by rewards makes them serviceable. If faith decays, there will be disruption. If rewards are deficient, commands will not be respected. 17. Move not unless you see an advantage. Use not your troops unless there is something to be gained. Fight not unless the position is critical. Sun Tzŭ may at times appear to be overcautious, but he never goes so far in that direction as the remarkable passage in the Tao Te Ching, ch. 69. I dare not take the initiative, but prefer to act on the defensive. I dare not advance an inch, but prefer to retreat a foot. 18. No ruler should put troops into the field merely to gratify his own spleen. No general should fight a battle simply out of pique. 19. If it is to your advantage, make a forward move. If not, stay where you are. This is repeated from 11. Section 17. Here I feel convinced that it is an interpolation, for it is evident that Section 20 ought to follow immediately on Section 18. 20. Anger may in time change to gladness. Vexation may be succeeded by content. 21. But a kingdom that has once been destroyed can never come again into being. The Wu state was destined to be a melancholy example of this saying. Nor can the dead ever be brought back to life. 22. Hence the enlightened ruler is heedful, and the good general full of caution. This is the way to keep a country at peace and an army intact. 1. Unless you enter the tiger's lair, you cannot get hold of the tiger's cubs. Chapter 13. The Use of Spies. 1. Sun Tzŭ said, raising a host of 100,000 men and marching them great distances entails heavy loss on the people and a drain on the resources of the state. The daily expenditure will amount to 1,000 ounces of silver. Cf. 2. Sections 1, 13, 14. There will be commotion at home and abroad, and men will drop down exhausted on the highways. Cf. Tao Te Ching, ch. 30. Where troops have been quartered, brambles and thorns spring up. Changyu has the note, we may be reminded of the saying, on serious ground, gather and plunder. Why then should carriage and transportation cause exhaustion on the highways? The answer is that not victuals alone, but all sorts of munitions of war have to be conveyed to the army. Besides, the injunction to forage on the enemy only means that when an army is deeply engaged in hostile territory, scarcity of food must be provided against. Hence, without being solely dependent on the enemy for corn, we must forage in order that there may be an uninterrupted flow of supplies. Then, again, there are places like salt deserts where provisions being unobtainable, supplies from home cannot be dispensed with. As many as 700,000 families will be impeded in their labor. Mei Yaochen says, men will be lacking at the plotel. The allusion is to the system of dividing land into 9 parts, each consisting of about 15 acres, the plot in the center being cultivated on behalf of the state by the tenants of the other 8. It was here also, so Tzŭ tells us, that their cottages were built and a well sunk, to be used by all in common. C2. Section 12, note. In time of war, one of the families had to serve in the army, while the other 7 contributed to its support. Thus, by a levy of 100,000 men, reckoning 1 able-bodied soldier to each family, the husbandry of 700,000 families would be affected. 2. Hostile armies may face each other for years, striving for the victory, which is decided in a single day. This being so, to remain in ignorance of the enemy's condition simply because one grudges the outlay of 100 ounces of silver in honors and emoluments. For spies is of course the meaning, though it would spoil the effect of this curiously elaborate exordium if spies were actually mentioned at this point. Is the height of inhumanity. Sun Tzŭ's agreement is certainly ingenious. He begins by adverting to the frightful misery and vast expenditure of blood and treasure which war always brings in its train. Now, unless you are kept informed of the enemy's condition and are ready to strike at the right moment, a war may drag on for years. The only way to get this information is to employ spies, and it is impossible to obtain trustworthy spies unless they are properly paid for their services. But it is surely false economy to grudge a comparatively trifling amount for this purpose, when every day that the war lasts eats up an incalculably greater sum. This grievous burden falls on the shoulders of the poor, and hence Sun Tzŭ concludes that to neglect the use of spies is nothing less than a crime against humanity. 3. One who acts thus is no leader of men, no present help to his sovereign, no master of victory. This idea, that the true object of war is peace, has its root in the national temperament of the Chinese. Even so far back as 597 BC, these memorable words were uttered by Prince Chuang of the Tzŭ state. The Chinese character for prowess is made up of the characters for to stay and to spear, cessation of hostilities. Military prowess is seen in the repression of cruelty, the calling in of weapons, the preservation of the appointment of heaven, the firm establishment of merit, the bestowal of happiness on the people, putting harmony between the princes, the diffusion of wealth. 4. Thus, what enables the wise sovereign and the good general to strike and conquer and achieve things beyond the reach of ordinary men is foreknowledge. That is, knowledge of the enemy's dispositions and what he means to do. 5. Now this foreknowledge cannot be elicited from spirits. It cannot be obtained inductively from experience. Tzŭ's note is, knowledge of the enemy cannot be gained by reasoning from other analogous cases, nor by any deductive calculation. Li Chuan says, quantities like length, breadth, distance, and magnitude are susceptible of exact mathematical determination. Human actions cannot be so calculated. 6. Knowledge of the enemy's dispositions can only be obtained from other men. Mei Yaochen has rather an interesting note. Knowledge of the spirit world is to be obtained by divination. Information in natural science may be sought by inductive reasoning. The laws of the universe can be verified by mathematical calculation, but the dispositions of an enemy are ascertainable through spies and spies alone. 7. Hence the use of spies, of whom there are 5 classes. 1. Local spies. 2. Inward spies. 3. Converted spies. 4. Doomed spies. 5. Surviving spies. 8. When these 5 kinds of spy are all at work, none can discover the secret system. This is called divine manipulation of the threads. It is the sovereign's most precious faculty. Cromwell, one of the greatest and most practical of all cavalry leaders, had officers styled scoutmasters, whose business it was to collect all possible information regarding the enemy through scouts and spies, etc., and much of his success in war was traceable to the previous knowledge of the enemy's moves thus gained. 1.9. Having local spies means employing the services of the inhabitants of a district. Sun Tzŭ says, in the enemy's country, win people over by kind treatment and use them as spies. 10. Having inward spies, making use of officials of the enemy. Sun Tzŭ enumerates the following classes as likely to do good service in this respect: worthy men who have been degraded from office, criminals who have undergone punishment, also favorite concubines who are greedy for gold, men who are aggrieved at being in subordinate positions, or who have been passed over in the distribution of posts, others who are anxious that their side should be defeated in order that they may have a chance of displaying their ability and talents, fickle turncoats who always want to have a foot in each boat. Officials of these several kinds, he continues, should be secretly approached and bound to one's interests by means of rich presents. In this way you will be able to find out the state of affairs in the enemy's country, ascertain the plans that are being formed against you, and moreover disturb the harmony and create a breach between the sovereign and his ministers. The necessity for extreme caution, however, in dealing with inward spies, appears from an historical incident related by Ho Shi. Lo Shang, governor of Aichou, sent his general Wei Pa to attack the rebel Li Sung of Shu in his stronghold at Pai. After each side had experienced a number of victories and defeats, Li Sung had recourse to the services of a certain Padai, a native of Wutu. He began to have him whipped until the blood came, and then sent him off to Lo Shang, whom he was to delude by offering to cooperate with him from inside the city, and to give a fire signal at the right moment for making a general assault. Lo Shang, confiding in these promises, marched out all his best troops, and placed Wei Pa and others at their head with orders to attack at Patai's bidding. Meanwhile, Li Xiang's general, Li Xiang, had prepared an ambuscade on their line of march, and Patai, having reared long scaling ladders against the city walls, now lighted the beacon fire. Wei Po's men raced up on seeing the signal and began climbing the ladders as fast as they could, while others were drawn up by ropes lowered from above. More than 100 of Lo Shang's soldiers entered the city in this way, every one of whom was forthwith beheaded. Li Sung then charged with all his forces, both inside and outside the city, and routed the enemy completely. This happened in 303 AD. I do not know where Ho Shi got the story from. It is not given in the biography of Li Sung or that of his father Li Te, Qin Shu, ch. 120, 121. 11. Having converted spies, getting hold of the enemy's spies and using them for our own purposes. By means of heavy bribes and liberal promises detaching them from the enemy's service, and inducing them to carry back false information as well as to spy in turn on their own countrymen. On the other hand, Xiao Shixian says that we pretend not to have detected him, but contrive to let him carry away a false impression of what is going on. Several of the commentators accept this as an alternative definition, but that it is not what Sun Tzŭ meant is conclusively proved by his subsequent remarks about treating the converted spy generously. Section 21. SQQ. Ho Shi notes 3 occasions on which converted spies were used with conspicuous success. 1. By Tian Tan in his defense of Chimo, see Supra, page 90. 2. By Chao Shi on his march to Oyu, see page 57. And by the wily Fan Chu in 260 BC, when Lin Po was conducting a defensive campaign against Qin. The king of Chao strongly disapproved of Lin Po's cautious and dilatory methods, which had been unable to avert a series of minor disasters, and therefore lent a ready ear to the reports of his spies, who had secretly gone over to the enemy and were already in Fan Chu's pay. They said, The only thing which causes Qin anxiety is lest Cao Qua should be made general. Lin Pa they consider an easy opponent, who is sure to be vanquished in the long run. Now this Cao Qua was a son of the famous Cao Shi. From his boyhood, he had been wholly engrossed in the study of war and military matters, until at last he came to believe that there was no commander in the whole empire who could stand against him. His father was much disquieted by this overweening conceit and the flippancy with which he spoke of such a serious thing as war, and solemnly declared that if ever Qua was appointed general, he would bring ruin on the armies of Cao. This was the man who, in spite of earnest protests from his own mother and the veteran statesman Lin Xiangju, was now sent to succeed Lin Pa. Needless to say, he proved no match for the redoubtable Pa Qi and the great military power of Qin. He fell into a trap by which his army was divided into two and his communications cut, and after a desperate resistance lasting 46 days, during which the famished soldiers devoured one another, he was himself killed by an arrow, and his whole force, amounting, it is said, to 400,000 men, ruthlessly put to the sword. 12. Having doomed spies, doing certain things openly for purposes of deception, and allowing our own spies to know of them and report them to the enemy. Tzŭ gives the best exposition of the meaning. We ostentatiously do things calculated to deceive our own spies, who must be led to believe that they have been unwittingly disclosed. Then, when these spies are captured in the enemy's lines, they will make an entirely false report, and the enemy will take measures accordingly, only to find that we do something quite different. The spies will thereupon be put to death. As an example of doomed spies, Hoshi mentions the prisoners released by Pan Xichao in his campaign against Yarkand. See page 132. He also refers to Tang Qian, who in 630 AD was sent by Tai Tsung to lull the Turkish Khan Chili into fancied security, until Li Qing was able to deliver a crushing blow against him. Chang Yu says that the Turks revenged themselves by killing Tang Qian, but this is a mistake, for we read in both the Old and the New Tang history, ch. 58, folios 2 and ch. 89, folios 8 respectively, that he escaped and lived on until 656. Li Ichi played a somewhat similar part in 203 BC, when sent by the king of Han to open peaceful negotiations with Qi. He has certainly more claim to be described a doomed spy, for the king of Qi, being subsequently attacked without warning by Han Hsin, and infuriated by what he considered the treachery of Li Ichi, ordered the unfortunate envoy to be boiled alive. 13. Surviving spies, finally, are those who bring back news from the enemy's camp. This is the ordinary class of spies, properly so called, forming a regular part of the army. Tzŭ says, your surviving spy must be a man of keen intellect, though in outward appearance a fool, of shabby exterior, but with a will of iron. He must be active, robust, endowed with physical strength and courage, thoroughly accustomed to all sorts of dirty work, able to endure hunger and cold, and to put up with shame and ignominy. Hoshi tells the following story of Tashi Wu of the Sui dynasty. When he was governor of eastern Qin, Shenwu of Qi made a hostile movement upon Shaoyuan. The emperor Tai Tzŭ, Cao Tzŭ, sent Tashi Wu to spy upon the enemy. He was accompanied by 2 other men. All 3 were on horseback and wore the enemy's uniform. When it was dark, they dismounted a few hundred feet away from the enemy's camp and stealthily crept up to listen, until they succeeded in catching the passwords used in the army. Then they got on their horses again and boldly passed through the camp under the guise of night watchmen, and more than once, happening to come across a soldier who was committing some breach of discipline, they actually stopped to give the culprit a sound cudgeling. Thus they managed to return with the fullest possible information about the enemy's dispositions, and received warm commendation from the emperor, who in consequence of their report was able to inflict a severe defeat on his adversary. 14. Hence it is that with none in the whole army are more intimate relations to be maintained than with spies. Sun Tzŭ and Mei Yaochen point out that the spy is privileged to enter even the general's private sleeping tent. None should be more liberally rewarded. In no other business should greater secrecy be preserved. Sun Tzŭ gives a graphic touch. All communication with spies should be carried mouth-to. The following remarks on spies may be quoted from Turin, who made perhaps larger use of them than any previous commander. Spies are attached to those who give them most. He who pays them ill is never served. They should never be known to anybody, nor should they know one another. When they propose anything very material, secure their persons, or have in your possession their wives and children as hostages for their fidelity. Never communicate anything to them but what is absolutely necessary that they should know. 2. 15. Spies cannot be usefully employed without a certain intuitive sagacity. Mei Yaochen says, in order to use them, one must know fact from falsehood and be able to discriminate between honesty and double-dealing. Wang Shi, in a different interpretation, thinks more along the lines of intuitive perception and practical intelligence. Sun Tzŭ strangely refers these attributes to the spies themselves. Before using spies, we must assure ourselves as to their integrity of character and the extent of their experience and skill. But he continues, a brazen face and a crafty disposition are more dangerous than mountains or rivers. It takes a man of genius to penetrate such. So that we are left in some doubt as to his real opinion on the passage. 16. They cannot be properly managed without benevolence and straightforwardness. Chang Yu says, when you have attracted them by substantial offers, you must treat them with absolute sincerity. Then they will work for you with all their might. 17. Without subtle ingenuity of mind, one cannot make certain of the truth of their reports. Mei Yaochen says, be on your guard against the possibility of spies going over to the service of the enemy. 18. Be subtle. Be subtle. And use your spies for every kind of business. Cf. 6. Section 9. 19. If a secret piece of news is divulged by a spy before the time is ripe, he must be put to death together with the man to whom the secret was told. Word for word, the translation here is, if spy matters are heard before, our plans are carried out, etc. Sun Tzŭ's main point in this passage is, whereas you kill the spy himself as a punishment for letting out the secret, the object of killing the other man is only, as Chen Hao puts it, to stop his mouth and prevent news leaking any further. If it had already been repeated to others, this object would not be gained. Either way, Sun Tzŭ lays himself open to the charge of inhumanity, though Sun Tzŭ tries to defend him by saying that the man deserves to be put to death, for the spy would certainly not have told the secret unless the other had been at pains to worm it out of him. 20. Whether the object be to crush an army, to storm a city, or to assassinate an individual, it is always necessary to begin by finding out the names of the attendants, the aides-de-camp. Literally visitors is equivalent, as Tzŭ says, to those whose duty it is to keep the general supplied with information, which naturally necessitates frequent interviews with him. The doorkeepers and sentries of the general in command. Our spies must be commissioned to ascertain these. As the first step, no doubt towards finding out if any of these important functionaries can be won over by bribery. 21. The enemy's spies who have come to spy on us must be sought out, tempted with bribes, led away, and comfortably housed. Thus they will become converted spies and available for our service. 22. It is through the information brought by the converted spy that we are able to acquire and employ local and inward spies. Tzŭ says, through conversion of the enemy's spies we learn the enemy's condition. And Chang Yu says, we must tempt the converted spy into our service, because it is he that knows which of the local inhabitants are greedy of gain, and which of the officials are open to corruption. 23. It is owing to his information, again, that we can cause the doomed spy to carry false tidings to the enemy. Sun Tzŭ says, because the converted spy knows how the enemy can best be deceived. 24. Lastly, it is by his information that the surviving spy can be used on appointed occasions. 25. The end and aim of spying in all its 5 varieties is knowledge of the enemy, and this knowledge can only be derived, in the first instance, from the converted spy. As explained in sections 22-24. He not only brings information himself, but makes it possible to use the other kinds of spy to advantage. Hence it is essential that the converted spy be treated with the utmost liberality. 26. Of old, the rise of the Yin dynasty. Sun Tzŭ means the Shang dynasty, founded in 1766 BC. Its name was changed to Yin by Pan King in 1401. Was due to Ai Qi, better known as Ai Yin, the famous general and statesman who took part in Xie Qingtang's campaign against Qi Ke, who had served under the Xia. Likewise, the rise of the Zhou dynasty was due to Liu Ya. Liu Shang rose to high office under the tyrant Zhou Hsn, whom he afterwards helped to overthrow. Popularly known as Tai Kung, a title bestowed on him by Wen Wang, he is said to have composed a treatise on war, erroneously identified with the Liu Tao, who had served under the Yin. There is less precision in the Chinese than I have thought it well to introduce into my translation, and the commentaries on the passage are by no means explicit. But, having regard to the context, we can hardly doubt that Sun Tzŭ is holding up Ai Qi and Liu Ya as illustrious examples of the converted spy, or something closely analogous. His suggestion is that the Xia and Yin dynasties were upset owing to the intimate knowledge of their weaknesses and shortcoming which these former ministers were able to impart to the other side. Mei Yaochen appears to resent any such aspersion on these historic names. Ai Yin and Liu Ya, he says, were not rebels against the government. Xia could not employ the former, hence Yin employed him. Yin could not employ the latter, hence Ho employed him. Their great achievements were all for the good of the people. Ho Shi is also indignant. How should 2 divinely inspired men, such as I and Liu, have acted as common spies? Sun Tzŭ's mention of them simply means that the proper use of the 5 classes of spies is a matter which requires men of the highest mental caliber like I and Liu, whose wisdom and capacity qualified them for the task. The above words only emphasize this point. Ho Shi believes then that the 2 heroes are mentioned on account of their supposed skill in the use of spies. But this is very weak. 27. Hence it is only the enlightened ruler and the wise general who will use the highest intelligence of the army for purposes of spying, and thereby they achieve great results. Tumu closes with a note of warning. Just as water, which carries a boat from bank to bank, may also be the means of sinking it, so reliance on spies, while production of great results, is ofttimes the cause of utter destruction. Spies are a most important element in war, because on them depends an army's ability to move. Chia Lin says that an army without spies is like a man with ears or eyes.